So up next, we have another awesome talk by another amazing thinker in the space. So we have a talk called Decentralized Trust as a Web3 Primitive. Danny from the Ceramic team is going to be leading this chat. And Danny, you have a little bit more time, which is nice. So if you want to go a little bit long, you've got the space for it. But would love to have you join me up on stage, share your video, and otherwise take it away. Would love to hear more about how you're thinking about trust, data, identity, data sovereignty, all those topics I'm sure are overlapping here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jacob. Can you hear me okay before I dive straight in?
Yeah, you're coming through awesome.
Cool. Let me share my screen.
Sounds good.
All right. Cool. Well, thanks again, Jacob. Excited to be here. HackFS is always one of my favorite hackathons of the year. We always see some incredible projects. So very excited to get into the meat of it and see what people start building, and excited to be part of the opening series here. So as Jacob previewed, I'm going to be talking today about trust as a primitive for Web3. And a really core building block to start to bring some of the use cases around Web3 and more sophisticated applications to life, on par with financial Legos and data Legos. I think trust is a really important aspect that we don't dive into quite enough in the right way. So that's what we'll be talking about today. Before we dive in, just quickly about me, very quickly. Danny Zuckerman. I am one of the founders of 3box Labs, have been working on issues around decentralized data, identity, reputation, all of which touch trust for 4.5 years now. Steward of Ceramic Network, which is the protocol that we've been building at 3box Labs for decentralized data. And I will stop there, more about my bio. And then on the right-hand side, some places to come find me and us. But that's the least interesting part of what we'll talk about. So very big picture. I think the goal of HackFS and building around Web3 is to start to move us from talking about the stack, the Web3 infrastructure stack, which can be pictured in a lot of different ways. Here's one that I really like from the Edge and Node DevRel team, and start talking much more about the things that you can do with the stack, the applications, use cases, and users and value that's being created on top of all of this infrastructure. And it kind of begs the question, why aren't we there yet? What are the missing pieces when so much great infrastructure has been built? And I don't mean to take away from that. The place that we're at today compared to this time last year when HackFS took off is way more sophisticated, and the primitives are way better. And so we are getting much closer, but we still don't see a massive amount of mainstream ready high scale applications and things that are even at a point to do that. And this talks about one of the reasons why. Another piece of the framing and the kind of issue of trust has been a hot topic in crypto Twitter and Web3 world recently, for a lot of reasons. Among them is the Decentralized Society paper from Pooja, Glenn, and Vitalik. And I just highlighted this one quote at the top of their abstract: Web3 can eschew today's hyper-financialization in favor of a more transformative, pluralist future. And their paper was really about the need for us to move beyond purely financial applications, why we hadn't to date, and what was needed to, or one course for what was needed to do that. And trust is really at the center of this. I think a little bit, unfortunately, a lot of the conversation that kicked off after that paper became this massive debate between the implementations of how to get that trust, in particular soul-bound tokens, non-transferable tokens that could be issued on the blockchain as a way to start to issue signals of trust and reputation, versus DIDs and credentials, which is the stack that many in the identity world and the off-chain data world have been working on for quite a while. And so if you've been poking around the space, or if you've been part of this debate, you've seen a little bit of a flame war between these two implementations. That's not what I want to talk about today, unless we go really fast and have some extra time at the end. What I want to talk about instead, at least at first, is the importance of reputation as a mechanism for trust. So very quick story here. And one of my favorite fun facts about the founding of the United States and the founding fathers is that Ben Franklin wrote a gossip column amongst the many other things that he did. And this seems like very strange and at odds with some of the reputation around Ben Franklin. But he knew that his town needed some trust to be able to work together and start to mature the things that they could do as a newly burgeoning society. They didn't know each other that well. It was a lot of people who had recently migrated or were migrating between different towns on the East Coast, and there weren't a lot of norms established in this brand new society. And among the many things that he did was write a gossip column in the local paper. And gossip has this very negative connotation today, but one thing that gossip does is it's a way to create reputations about people. It's a way for third parties to trade information, including negative information about others. And it's a really important way that we have developed as societies to basically put reputation at stake. And when reputation is at stake for individuals, it really helps reinforce the norms and values of that society that they're a part of. And this can be for a society like the United States, or it can be for an application and the users of that application or the constituents in a tokenized network. But reputation being on the line in different ways is a really important mechanism to get people to work together. It's not the only one, and we'll talk a little bit later about how this interplays with tokens and financial incentives, but it's always been a critical one. This was the case on Web 2 as well. If we look at some of the biggest segments and success stories from the last major wave of internet companies, reputation played a huge part, and they could not have succeeded without reputation. Trust was not an extra feature, it was a key enabler. eBay, the first really massive e-commerce success, succeeded in huge part because they were able to build trust between sellers and buyers in a way that no one really believed was going to be possible early on. You were going onto this website, you were paying money to a random person somewhere in the world who you didn't know, had no way of knowing. And eBay was a startup at the time. And you just had to trust that the seller was actually going to sell you the item and that it was going to be what they said it was, especially with some of these used goods that they would be not broken, that there was actually original condition that was new in box. And it was a huge pain to be able to actually, like, if you got an item that wasn't what you were promised, to actually track that down and get resolution was fairly painful. And so scoring and ratings and reputation was the primary mechanism that actually enforced good behavior and made eBay a massive hit. Same thing with Amazon later when they opened up to third-party sellers. So reputation as a way to build trust amongst parties was critical to doing any commerce online. Any social platform had to build trust. In Facebook, it was friends, LinkedIn, it was connections, Twitter was followers. But they all put front and center the followers that you have in common with someone else. So not every piece of reputation needs to be quantified. Some of it is very contextual. And so showing the connections you share in common with someone is a way to very quickly build some trust, understanding, and familiarity on these social platforms. Airbnb is a quote from the CEO of Airbnb: "The trust of our community is our top priority." Again, similar to eBay, but probably even more so, nobody believed that Airbnb could succeed in getting people comfortable staying in strangers' houses or comfortable with strangers staying in their own home. But it was by creating a really sophisticated and trustworthy itself reputation system that they were able to build this massive company, but also this really new way of having economies, different sharing economies. And so what all of these had right when they're trying to build what you can think of as these little digital societies on each of these platforms is that I think what reflected in this quote from Jonathan Haidt, the most important principle for designing an ethical society is to make sure that everyone's reputation is on the line all the time. That sounds very punitive And in some ways it is, and we'll come back to that. Vitalik has been talking recently about negative reputation, which again makes it sound punitive. But if you're trying to get people to behave in a way that is in the not just their own interest, like the capitalism and financial incentives work so well because in a one-time game, people act in their own interest and it balances out and allocates capital. But if you're trying to do things that are not one-time financial games, but rather repeated games where you need to actually build familiarity and context and trust, basically any social application or use case, you need reputation to be able to convince people that they should play by the rules, that they should do what is expected in the norms of that system. And there needs to be a way for them to lose reputation if what they do goes against that. And so one thing that we learned from this is that reputation is inherently a social thing, not an individual thing. So all these Web2 companies did a great job building their reputation systems. The problem is they're built in silos. And Jeff Bezos said a brand is a company's reputation. And so as all of us users are using these platforms and building reputation, the social capital that's built, the trust that's being built, goes a little bit to each of us as individuals, but mostly it's accruing to the companies who built these reputation systems in these walled gardens. And they're trapped within those gardens or within those silos. And so you have no agency or portability or composability to use that trust elsewhere. And this is really great for some of these big Web2 platforms, but it took them a long time to build it up, and we don't really have, and you see tons of crypto companies trying to kind of bootstrap off of the trust that's been built up on Twitter, which is why we are constantly verifying our Twitter handle for different services on Web3 to try to build off of that. But we don't want to replicate this same issue in Web3 of having to rebuild trust over and over again, because that's going to dramatically slow down how quickly we can build up trust on Web3 as a whole, and therefore how quickly we can build up applications and use cases that are meaningful beyond financial ones. And so the question is, if we're not doing reputation on these platforms and in these silos, where are we doing it? And we kind of need a new organizing principle, and that organizing principle for trust as a primitive in Web3 is to organize it around users, and users individually, kind of put users at the center and agency of their own reputations and the data that makes it up, but also give users kind of control over and a share in kind of a collective way to manage reputation and data. And so I'll talk about what that means abstractly, but first I want to give a few examples of projects that are doing this really well already today, because we're starting to see the emergence of trust as a primitive in Web3 in some very cool ways just in the last few months. First example, in kind of the commerce and finance world, was a partnership between CyberConnect, which is a social graph protocol, and RockFi, to basically look at on-chain data and a bunch of other information about a user and create a credit score, and then to link that credit score to a user's profile and their social graph, and also incorporate their social graph on CyberConnect into their reputation and their credit score. And so what this does is it creates a way. So CyberConnect is this social graph protocol built on Ceramic, which is a public data network, and it creates this open shared way to start to aggregate information like a credit score in a way that anybody can compose on and use and interoperate with, instead of it being locked into one place. And so once it's done once for one lending platform, now it's accessible and extendable by anybody. Second example is Orbis, which is a decentralized social application. And it looks a little bit like a Twitter, but with more of a community bent to it. Lots of conversation happening there every day. Go check it out, orbis.club. But like with any social media platform, there's problems with content moderation and ranking of content and creating a feed. And So they've included, like many social platforms, comments and upvotes, but also downvotes. And the downvotes are actually a way for people to signal about the value of not just content, but implicitly the author of any given piece of content. And so an author that is creating lots of content that's getting downvoted is implicitly building a reputation that can be looked at to say this person is creating low value or spam content. And that can be used by Orbis to change their application, but also if another social app joins, because this is happening on a public network, they can also look at that same data, that same reputation, and say, okay, this author has already built up a reputation as distrustworthy. I'm not going to let them in. A third example, Gitcoin recently released before the last grants round, Gitcoin Passport. And Gitcoin had been aggregating lots of different signals of proof of humanity. So proof of humanity itself, and Bright ID, and linking to your Google account, your Twitter account. All of these give some insight into a user is just a single user. And the reason this is so important for Gitcoin is they run these grants rounds with matching funds, and they need to protect against civil attacks and collusion against people who are trying to get kind of more matching than they deserve. And so they need to have some idea of one person is acting, a person is only acting within the grants round in one way. And so to do that, they've aggregated all these scores and created a JSON document that they sign into a credential and put into the user's profile, this Gitcoin Passport. And so they needed it for their own application, but because it's linked to the user's DID and key, now that is available for any other application on Web3 to query and use also. And so again, it's not just a single walled garden implementation of reputation. It's this new primitive for trust that others in Web3 can build on. So how are they all doing this? I've kind of referenced it a little bit, but really quickly, the anatomy of what these pieces of trust, which is really, it's data that's aggregating to reputation. What does this actually look like, and how are people building this? Especially for those of you who will be hacking unrelated things this hackathon. And so there's a few different flows, but very generally, a user might submit a claim that they are a certain person, if they have a certain credit score. They'll just bring certain data to bear, or they'll just interact with an application. And that application can run a service that verifies the claim, or just, it's generating the activity. For example, the fact that a user participated in a working group for a DAO, and they create a piece of data and they sign it. If it's a certain format, it might be called a verifiable credential, which is a spec from W3C for what some of these claims look like. But it can be any piece of signed data. And they sign that data using the application key, DID. And they write that claim to the user's stream on a public data network, in this case, and the one that I work on, Ceramic. And that is now tied to the user's key and associated to them, but written by the application. And so you have this shared piece of data, and it could be written not by an application, but by another user, more peer-to-peer. And so you now have this signed data on this network that can be shared. And what you're starting to build up is this single public network that maintains all of this data and all of this latent trust that others can build upon, and start to create, not just reputation, but other forms of signal that lets you do much more powerful applications, and ones that are much more than one-time financial apps. So yeah, what this is starting to build up just implicitly is this shared graph of trusted data, trusted because it's being signed by DIDs. And so it has some properties that are really good for building trust and reputation in ways that are shareable across contexts. It's both sovereign and social. And we'll talk about in a few minutes the soul-bound tokens versus credentials. They both have limitations. They both get used in ways here, actually. But sovereign social because things are being signed and organized around private keys, but the data itself is on a public graph. And so you have user control, but not it's not purely individual, because a lot of data, and especially our reputation, is shared between users. And so you need to be able to make attestations and claims about others to build reputation. It's provably authentic because it's being signed, it's being verified by nodes, and that reputation is at stake, because if you've accumulated lots of positive reputation, lots of positive claims, but then you also start to get some negative ones, you're actually damaging yourself. And so, going back to the John Haidt quote, reputation's only super valuable if it's at stake all of the time. It's composable because it's structured data. It's being signed with schema, and it can be used across chains. And I think most importantly, it's emergent. It doesn't need to be a perfect reputation system right off the bat. First, these use cases are being built for their own value. Gitcoin built a passport for their own need, for their grants program. So the value starts locally, but now others in DeFi or L1s who also need anti-Sybil or proof of individuality can start to use that same passport, extend it, add new claims to it, add new algorithms for how they're calculating to it. And so you start off of this one, trusted context in one use case, but because it's composable and provably authentic and on a shared network, others can start to build on that same thing and extend it. Similar to how we saw DeFi Legos really extend the use cases of finance and blockchains. Similarly, this trust primitive can very quickly get built upon and extended in powerful ways. And so what that creates is this kind of composable set of building blocks for reputation in Web3. And reputation, again, is really just an algorithm on top of lots of data. So what this really means is composable signed data in Web3 of all different types, preferences, participation in DAOs, content that's upvoted, lots of followers on certain social networks. And you have these composable bits of trust to build new Web3 applications that can resist attacks. So I said we weren't going to make this about the implementation details, but a little bit about like the way to build up these trust primitives and what works well and what doesn't work well. And so a few things that are all important to these systems, but on their own, not enough. So we'll talk about soul-bound tokens, we'll talk about DIDs and verified credentials, and talk about tokens themselves. Why can't we just use financial incentives for everything? So really quickly, soul-bound tokens can be really powerful. There's a value in bringing some elements of reputation on chain in very thoughtful ways to make it interoperable with some of the other things that happen on chain today, especially financial markets. But they're not a good mechanism for every piece of data that we want to build in as a trust primitive. They can be encrypted, and these can continue to change, but a public by default method for publishing data is going to really compromise privacy for users and make people shy away from using it. There's lots of scale issues, and you're chain siloing everything that you put on a blockchain as opposed to making it more interoperable. Verified credentials and DIDs in the stack that many in the identity world have been working on for a long time play a huge role in, should play a huge role in building trust for Web3 applications. One of the key elements of that stack is selective disclosure of VCs, giving users the power to decide what data to share when, which really helps privacy compared to soul-bound tokens. The issue is you can't have complete selective disclosure over data and actually build powerful reputation systems. Imagine an Airbnb-like application where every review and rating that you got was put into a private data vault that you controlled as a user. And then when you went to go use the application again, you would get to choose which pieces of data you shared and which you didn't. You would only share your 5.0 ratings, and every user would have a 5.0 rating, and there wouldn't actually be any trust in the system. And so reputation systems are necessarily somewhat public and social and involve some third-party claims. And so pure sovereign systems don't work for building full reputation systems. They also have some challenges around UX and security of key revocation and credential revocation and rotating keys. Maybe most importantly is why not just use tokens? Tokens are great incentive, financial incentives for things, and most of the crypto space to date has relied on using tokens as incentives to align networks. But there's a huge downside to over-financializing everything. And as soon as there is a potential to make profit, our arbitrageurs will flood a system and find any profit to make and completely overcrowd any of the more pro-social behaviors. An example I heard recently from Stephen at Cloud Fund, I'll give him credit, was that like, how come we all pay our phone bills on time, or those of us who do? And it's very rarely because we're actually scared of Verizon coming to take us to court and settle our phone bill. It's much more because we don't want to have our credit score harmed. Reputation is actually a much more powerful day-to-day incentive than financial incentives in a lot of cases. And they don't coexist well. As soon as you introduce financial incentives, it crowds out reputation and other types of incentives because all of the financial arbitrage comes in. And so as soon as we bring in tokens, we're no longer in a social multi-time game. We're in a one-time game with arbitraging. And the incentive actually gets worse, not better. And so one more quote from Adam Smith, who's most known as being the inventor of capitalism, but he wrote another book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is really largely about reputation and how we're mostly motivated by reputation and things like it rather than by capital. Man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. So to be seen in the eyes of others as good and to live up to that. And so even the founder of capitalism believe, that the book that kind of is looked at as the founding of capitalism is about how the invisible hand can make markets be a great way to allocate capital, but he didn't believe that was the right way to actually incentivize individuals. That was, for that, reputation is a much more powerful tool. So what to do with this? Some ideas that we've been talking about around our team and community that we'd love to see continue to build out the primitives for decentralized trust or to take use of it. Comment and rating plugins for different applications, for smart contracts, for tokens, for all sorts of stuff happening in the space. Reputation doesn't all have to be quantified. And so giving people ways to write verifiable information about what they're seeing and for others to use it can add a lot of context to what's happening in the space. Tracking contributions to DAO and endorsement on tools and what's happening, skills and what's happening. For those who've been around for a while, there was a huge wave of token curated registries a while ago. But what about reputation curated registries, a way for people to put their reputation at stake behind something, which probably means more to them than tokens and can't be attacked in the same way as token curated registries could. Reputation only sharing economies. So networks where you don't earn financial capital for contributing, but you do earn social capital, which has a softer power. Aggregating data around users, bridging from Web 2 to Web 3, or creating these personality profiles that can be used as an alternative to centralized ad IDs and things like it. So lots of different things that are now very achievable with the tools that we have for managing decentralized data and using the Web3 stack to start to do more with trust and more social use cases. I think I'm supposed to wind down. So just a couple of resources. If you want to know kind of how to use data to build some of these things, there's a talk from Matt Davis on Monday morning on building with composable data. There's a blog on how to build with composable trust and how other apps are doing it on blog.ceramic.network. And also some links here to come chat with others who are thinking about these things, building some of these things. And some bounties related to this from the ceramic team at HackFS for the hackathon as well. So I think that's it. I don't know if we're doing questions in this one, but again, here's some links to come find me or our team or some of this tech, and would love to see and hear from some of you on this, but also can't wait to see what some of you build in the hackathon the next few weeks.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Danny. I mean, I do have some small questions. I mean, I think this is a really fascinating topic in general, and like, it just seems to be such a missing block from the Web3 world versus like Web2. Like, if you think about it, almost like all of our institutions, financial lending, like all these different things are based on trust, reputation, and really enable you to do so many things. And like, as great as kind of DeFi has been in terms of like allowing anyone market participation and that kind of thing, like one aspect of that for sure is that like in almost all cases it has to be over collateralized. You have to have some sort of like way to get back the money in the end if somebody kind of messes you over or screws you over. But in the traditional financial markets, it's almost the opposite. It's almost always under collateralized. I guess my question to you would be like, I think we both could probably agree on the importance of trust and reputation and stuff, but maybe what has been so challenging about tackling this project and this problem? And I know it's a problem that a lot of people have been thinking about, and it is in a lot of ways like a bit of a holy grail. We'd love to hear a little bit more about just sort of some of the challenges involved in actually making this a reality.
Yeah, I think there's a few. The first is, so reputation is not the only way to build trust, but it's a really good one. And so if we focus just on that, I think the easiest way to look at what reputation is it's just a combination of data. In the real world, it's a combination of like experiences you have and what you hear about someone. In the digital world, it's like looking at a bunch of pieces of data and saying, like, well, what does this aggregate into? Its reputation. And we haven't had a great way to manage that data to date, to just like aggregate it in a Web3 native way. And I think that's changing very rapidly through many of the sponsors and the hosts of this hackathon and a bunch of others. But you need the right foundations to build on, first of all. I also think that there's a few different ways to start to build and bootstrap reputation, but like it's much harder to do it in abstract than it is to do it. It's like almost one of those problems that's harder in theory than it is in practice, because mathematically it's very hard to build decentralized reputation and to kind of bootstrap that. And you run into the who watches the watchman problem, and you need trusted seeds. But in practice, people trust Gitcoin. And so when they release the passport, which they are signing as a company, it's got trust from the beginning. And so when you start to build in these specific use cases and contexts, and you start to build trust from there, then you could start to extend from there. And so I think we've been missing those first initial cases with real applications that are building decentralized trust for themselves, and then that can be leveraged, beyond that. And so I think that's what we're starting to see. It's not an easy problem, even with that. There will start to be ways to attack it, and it's almost harder. It's definitely harder in Web3 than Web2, because people can just leave their private key and move to a new one. And so you can't limit participation in the same way. But I think we'll start to see a lot of these open systems where positive reputation gets you a lot of benefit, and then anyone who's found to be kind of going against the grain will be banished. And so there's a lot of cost to actually, a lot of opportunity cost to misbehaving. And so that's what we're starting to see, but it's taken a little while to get there.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I guess, yeah, I mean, at some point, like if you go far enough down the line, you've got to trust somebody, right? Whether that's Gitcoin or like some Oracle or something, like down the line, like you've got to trust something. It has to be the end. And I guess, like, it depends on maybe the rigor of trust that is required for your application. But I think in a lot of cases, you're right. Like, Gitcoin putting something out into the world, or, anybody kind of with enough skin in the game, being able to put something out in the wild and say, like, we are validating that this is the case. Like, that's probably enough for most applications. And then maybe there's like a much larger set of things, but maybe it's also the case where it's like exactly you just described. Like, it's like there are so many of these different attestation or type like trusted things that like you have so much positive trust that like even if like the Gitcoin side is lying, or even like one out of the like 50 different things that trust you is sort of like not trusted. I'm using the word trust a lot. it almost doesn't matter at that point, right? So yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
Go ahead, sorry.
I think that's a really interesting point that like we were at a phase in Web3 where it was so small for a while that like just knowing someone's ENS name was enough. That was enough trust because you just like knew who they were, what they had done, and what they had said. So you didn't need a score. And if we flash forward a couple of years, there'll be so much data and so many different, verifiers and services and reputation algorithms. The hard part won't be having trust, it'll be choosing which one to trust. And we're kind of in that middle portion today where we haven't built up some of those services, but we're past the point where just knowing someone's Twitter handle or username or their Telegram or Discord handle is enough.
Yeah, and everything ends up being composable too, which is super interesting. So, okay, cool. I mean, I could talk about this forever, so I'm gonna have to stop because I think we're already over time a little bit. But yeah, Danny, I really appreciate you coming and chatting about this. I agree. I think we're in the middle of it, and I think there's going to be some really interesting applications that come out once we sort of come out on the other side. And I think the earlier people start building with this is the faster that accelerates. So amazing. Well, really appreciate your time, Danny. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Jacob.